I'm joined now by CBS News political director Steve Chaggaris, who joins me now. Steve, I was kind of caught a little bit off guard there hearing the president talk specifically about pivoting now towards immigration reform. Republicans were criticized, Steve, out of Vegas when Democrats try to push gun control legislation. What do you make of the fact that we're hearing the president now say it's time to move on immigration?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the initial reaction to the president's tweets this morning and now his call at this news conference, per se, is the reaction is, why are you politicizing something less than 24 hours after several people were killed on the streets in New York in a terrorist incident? This is not the time to be bringing politics into this, but the president clearly feels that this is an opportunity, one, to look tough on terrorism, and two, to try to move forward on a signature issue of his, which is immigration reform, or at least changing the immigration laws. And so he talks a lot about this diversity lottery program, which has been in the sights of many conservatives over the years, something they feel it doesn't work, or they don't really like it, and they think it should be switched over to more of a merit-based system. You heard the president say that in his remarks. And so he's using this as an opportunity, less than 24 hours after this tragedy, to try to make political gains here. But there's been resistance not only from Democrats, but as you heard Margaret Brennan just say, also from some Republicans, including Jeff Flake, who isn't necessarily the biggest fan of the president, as we know, as we've talked about over the last few weeks. But still, starting a political fight so soon after this, it's just an interesting way of doing business. It's not something we've ever seen, at least in modern history, presidents do. We saw President Trump do this after Charlottesville as well, where he had that news conference, that famous news conference, where he got into it with reporters back and forth. Again, turning something into a political discussion at a time when people really are still processing the tragedy.
And Steve, remind us again, where are we on the immigration debate and legislation?
Nowhere. I mean, it's just nowhere. Margaret pointed out it's been something that Congress has just not been able to get anywhere on. Jeff Flake, who I mentioned before, the senator from Arizona, who announced he's not running for re-election, somebody who's not a fan, a Republican who's not a fan of the president, was involved deeply in a big immigration reform effort several years ago, and it failed. And part of that effort was to get rid of this, or at least tamp down this diversity lottery program, but it didn't work. And so the president going out there and declaring this the day after a tragedy, saying Congress needs to do this, I mean, we've seen the president make a lot of declarations about his agenda or about legislation, none of which have come to fruition yet. So I'm not sure where Congress is going to pick up with this, but I can't imagine Republicans are just going to pick up today just because the president said this and run to the floor of the House and Senate and start doing immigration legislation, immigration reform, just because the president's calling for it today.
Yeah, I also want to ask you while I have you, Steve, turning to another topic, the White House trying to distance itself from Paul Manafort, Rick Gates, George Papadopoulos. We had a whole slew of activity yesterday on the special counsel Russia probe. How much of this is going to be a problem for the White House as they continue to dismiss the charges around this?
Well, it's a problem for the people who, for them, with people who don't believe the president or believe what these people are saying about the Russia investigation. But, you know, what the president and the White House are doing are speaking to their supporters and saying, we didn't do anything wrong here. And they're going to continue to fight that fight. And until Robert Mueller turns something out that shows something completely different, shows that the president is guilty of collusion, or however they want to put that, they're going to continue to say this is all a load of nothing, it's all political witch hunt against the president, and that's just going to be their line. So it's a distraction, it's something that's not going away, it's something that I think they hoped was going away until Bob Mueller's moves on Monday, which put it back in the spotlight, but it's something he's going to have to deal with his entire time as president, whether that's it gets resolved in a first term, or if there is a second term of Trump, whether it takes that much longer to get it done. It's something that's going to dog him until it is resolved by the special prosecutor.
Steve, are there Democrats who should be concerned about this probe?
Well, sure. I mean, the Democrats are getting roped into this. You saw Tony Podesta, who's a lobbyist in town, who was working on some of the same issues as Paul Manafort was working on with Ukraine and with Russia, and he has sort of stepped back. He quit his lobbying firm, and who knows where this is all going to go. I mean, the president and other Republicans have been saying the special prosecutor needs to look into the Clinton campaign and the DNC for their funding of opposition research that resulted in a dossier against the president, and whether there are Russian connections there. We don't know if that's going to happen. But Democrats aren't necessarily totally off the hook here, but they're not the focus of this right now. Right now, the focus of this is President Trump, his campaign, people who work for his campaign, and people associated with his campaign. And so that is really where the focus is. And no matter how much Republicans and the president try to divert attention onto the other party and Hillary Clinton, right now that's not the focus.
I want to ask you about legislation right now. House Republicans have delayed rolling out their tax plan. We heard the president talk about it just a short time ago at the White House. What's the sense for tomorrow? What are they aiming for? What are the points of contention right now?
Well, we don't know a lot of the details, and I think that's part of the problem. Is they've got to get this bill in a position so they can roll it out and really not have a lot of vocal resistance from Republicans. Two big questions Republicans have. One is about a specific idea that may not show up in this, but we don't know for sure yet, which is removing the deduction for state and local taxes, which people who live in states where they pay a lot of state and local taxes, generally Democratic states, Republicans in those states don't want to see that deduction go, because people who vote for them in those states use that deduction and like that deduction. So that was one place where Republicans who are writing the bill thought they might be able to save some money and put it towards tax cuts. Well, now there are Republicans in those states that don't want that deduction to go. So that is a big point of contention. The other point of contention is, how are they going to pay for all these cuts? There are still conservative Republicans who are concerned about how much this is going to add to the deficit. And so until we see what's actually in the bill, and until we see what a CBO score shows and how much this is actually going to cost over the long term, we don't really know what kind of resistance you're going to get from Republicans. But they want to make sure they have their ducks in a row, at least to a point where they can unveil this thing without immediate resistance from people in their own party. And so that's where they are right now.
All right, our Steve Chaggaris coming to us from Washington. Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.